Hello, welcome to the podcast Ukrainian Studies at the University of Illinois. My name is Olga Khometa. I'm an assistant professor in Soviet and post-Soviet studies in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the UIUC. Today's topic is Maidan, Ukraine's Democratic Revolution, and the conversation will be with the Maidan's expert, Dr. Sophia Wilson. Hello, Sophia.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me here.
Dr. Sophia Wilson is an associate professor of political science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and the president of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. She was a visiting scholar at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute in 2015 and taught at the Harvard Ukrainian Summer Institute in 2017, 2019, and 2025. She was a Jeremy Hall postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Law, Society, and Culture at the Indiana University Moore School of Law in 2012-2013. In October of 2023, she was a visiting fellow at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin as she began her work on a new book comparing three occupations of Ukraine by Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern Russia. Today, Dr. Wilson will discuss her book, Maidan, Ukraine's Democratic Revolution, a powerful grassroots movement that restored democracy to a country slipping into authoritarianism. Dr. Wilson's study of the Ukrainian Revolution of 2013 and 14 gives a carefully researched account of the underbelly of the resistance process, investigating how participants self-organized to create the resistance, why the peaceful movement eventually turned to violence, and how the revolutionary process changed those who came to change the country. The Ukrainian state used violence and violations of due process to suppress the resistance, thereby declaring new boundaries in rights relations. Professor Wilson's book shows how the people pushed back in multiple arenas: the protest square, courtrooms, hospitals, churches, and media, to successfully challenge the constitutionality of the state's action. Your book is out on March 17th in McGill Queen's University Press, and we congratulate you on this marvelous achievement.
Thank you so much.
And let's get straight into the conversation about the book and your research focus and the Maidan. So the book's title is Maidan, Ukraine's Democratic Revolution. What makes it a revolution?
Thank you so much, Dr. Khometa. And what a great question. Of course, I spent years thinking about that question as I spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine interviewing those who took part in the revolution. And I attempted to write a very detailed account of what took place during those 3 winter months in 2013 and 2014. So what is a revolution, right? And was Maidan movement a revolution? It absolutely was, because revolution for anything to be a revolution, right? For any movement, social movement to be a revolution, you need to have two major aspects. One is you have to have mass involvement, right? Resistance, not just by certain small groups, but it has to be resistance of the masses. Did we have that in Ukraine? Absolutely. So only on December 1st of 2013, there were approximately 800,000 on the Maidan and surrounding areas in the capital of Ukraine. But during those 3 months, estimates are that there are several million people, up to 4 million people, who made it at least once to the center of Kiev from different parts of Ukraine. And the second element of a truly revolution, a successful revolution, it's a regime change. Now, some say Yanukovych was elected democratically, right? And then after the Maidan revolution, it was again a democracy. So maybe it wasn't a true revolution. Maybe it was, and in the Western media, the movement is often referred to simply as protests. But what I show through that detailed account is it truly was a revolution because it brought political change, because during those 3 months, it became a true authoritarian regime. So it was short-lived because Ukrainian society succeeded in reverting it back to democracy, but it truly was authoritarian regime because of police violence, but not only that's how it started, and that's what motivated lots of people to respond. But state violence kept increasing, and in January of 16th, the Ukrainian parliament passed authoritarian laws that restricted severely freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and multiple rights that were guaranteed by the Ukrainian constitution. And that's what mobilized people even further as they demanded that not only the laws, but those who pass such laws that restrict their very freedoms should not longer be in power. And followed what was followed is even much more severe regime, more severe repressions, as there were shootings, people were tortured, and that was followed by even sniper shootings in February. So there were multiple violations. There were violations of due process, which I examined. And it really, again, in a short span of time, but it really was practiced as an authoritarian regime. And so it was the success of the social movement that prevented that type of regime becoming permanent in Ukraine.
What is packed in that name? Dignity. Mm-hmm. So the revolution of dignity, what is packed in the dignity part of it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that is such an important question because, as we know, in 2004, the revolution that actually brought democracy to Ukraine, it was called the Orange Revolution because it was driven by the social response to elections that were manipulated. And the color of that party was orange. And so support for fair elections, in support for fair elections, people were wearing color orange. And that resulted, and that eventually brought democracy to Ukraine. Here, this also might, and sometimes Ukrainians refer to both events as Maidans, right? But this is the Maidan, and in Ukraine, absolutely, as you pointed out, it is called Revolution of Dignity. And why dignity, right? It is the concept of dignity here is tied into the concept of human rights, because human rights, in contrast to individual rights, where it's ability to express yourself in multiple ways, human rights is connected to the concept of protecting human security and protecting humans, protecting persons from abuses of government or abuses of other groups that cuts down to the core of their existence and their security. So as Maidaners were fighting for their constitutional rights, it wasn't just about what is in Constitution and what is not. It was about constitutional rights of citizens to be free of torture, to be free of beatings that were unleashed by the Yanukovych's administration in response to peaceful protests, to citizens' ability to express themselves and communicate their concerns to the state. And so therefore, dignity, the concept of this Maidan movement being a revolution of dignity, is tied up to their ability to preserve their very basic rights, their freedoms to life, their freedom of security, their freedom to from being abused by the state just because they want to express their opinion.
How did people in Ukraine manage to mobilize in such a short time? And ultimately, what is the secret of the Maidan? Why did Ukrainians succeed?
What a great question. Thank you, because of course that took me years trying to figure out. It truly was a grassroots movement. It truly was. We have in the past political scientists are more familiar with analyzing revolutions that are driven by certain leaders with certain ideologies and the way people respond. Here we have people who are rejecting not only those in power, but certain politicians who were in the political opposition, who pretended to be the leaders of that movement, but people rejected them as well. And in fact, they brought they mobilized by inviting those who would come in and say, what can I do? The response was always, do your best. And what was fascinating, that led to different ways that people were mobilizing to stop the state, to stop the message to the state that repressions was no longer allowed. But also they developed a quite fascinating network of social communication and social logistics, as for example, after police brutality, people would end up with broken limbs, even broken skulls, and so they would have to go to the hospitals. There, of course, after police would beat people up, then they would also go to the hospital because they knew that that's where revolutionaries would be, obviously, after they were attacked by police. So they would go there in the attempt to detain those protesters, those activists, and then throw them in jail. And as the courts were now under the state control as well, that was one of the major ways that Stop was trying to stop the state was attempting to stop the resistance. But Maidan existed not only on the Maidan Square, and that is why it's called the Maidan, right? The Maidan movement. Maidaners were everywhere. They were in the hospitals, helping those escape the police. The hospital, the doctors would not record the true nature of those claims. Activists and lawyers mobilized for free to come there and prevent the detentions. And if that didn't work, they would call on their friends who were journalists, who would come with gigantic cameras and point at those policemen who were trying to grab the revolutionaries. Of course, was multiple, again, violating the laws of Ukraine because they were not supposed to. If somebody is in a severe condition, of course, obviously the medical aid had to be offered first. And so this kind of public exposure often helped, right? But many lawyers also would go to the courtrooms and offer pro bono aid to help the revolutionaries who were detained. And there, what was fascinating, they knew that they would lose that case, for example, because during those 3 months, the system became so repressive so fast. But the idea was that they would keep fighting, whether it's on the streets, whether it's through social media, or very importantly in the courtrooms, by constantly exposing the state violations against the rights of citizens, and with that sending a very strong message to the state that they were not willing to accept these new terms of legality. So it's coming together from multiple parts of Ukraine, bringing different skills, and then very importantly, trusting each other and trusting strangers to help them organize, to help them connect to each other, and keep resisting.
Thank you. And the other sphere that I'm thinking of where people mobilized so quickly was independent media. Mm-hmm. And we had a guest a couple of weeks ago, Maxim Butkevich, who was a founder of Громадське Radio, that offered the, not the state-sponsored account of the news of what was going on the Maidan, but the Maidaners telling their truth about this event.
Absolutely. Yes, because the state media, when you would turn on TV, it would show that, nobody's really there, just maybe 5 people, right? It would downplay not really what people were fighting for, but how many people are there. And most certainly the state would cover up its violence, its violation of, its multiple violations of citizens' rights. And the independent media and social media and multiple other streaming accounts was part of the ways that revolutionaries were sending the message to not only to the state, but others in Ukraine and also different parts of the world, to show what is actually going on, to show the results of the police violence and people bleeding on the street, to counteract Russian propaganda that, for example, started a narrative that supposedly it's led by anti-Semitic groups. So here we are, one of the people who was organizing the streaming channel that they were doing through internet. They said, okay, so now they pointed to the group that was working with the synagogue to offer aid, medical aid to the revolutionaries, and they would immediately ask questions, and also on the side of that, Jewish organizations mobilized to send a very strong message to the rest of the world, saying that they were part of this resistance, that that there was no absolutely, it was not driven by anti-Semitic groups, but it was very much a movement against state repression, and they, as citizens of that country, proud citizens of Ukraine, want to fight for free Ukraine. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So what aspects of the revolution your book focuses on?
Mm-hmm. Of course, multiple aspects, right? And it took me years to write it because I wanted to write a very detailed account of what was happening. And I wanted to write it from the perspective of social actors. So I provide detailed analysis of violations, step-by-step violations that were done by the state to the people. But then I also analyze how people understood those repressions and how therefore they formed their movement in response to that repression. Right. So one of the movements, one of the aspects of the book is to understand why the movement turned violent. And what was fascinating is to learn about multiple hundreds of initiatives in the first month of the revolution that activists very consciously organized to make sure that the movement stays peaceful. lots of people would become angered when they would watch that their peers would get hurt or would disappear, and naturally it would cause more and more people trying to say perhaps violence is the only option. But Ukrainian Maidan activists invested quite a lot. One of my favorite examples, one of the activists said that after one of the major beatings that was done on the street against the protesters, they organized, so they said, a quiet evening. So she said she went to all stores nearby and called all her friends to buy as many candles as possible. So they purchased these hundreds of candles, and when people lots of concerned citizens would come that evening to express their concern with what the state was doing, she said, we started giving candles to people. And she said it helped with two ways. First of all, there's something about candle fire that pacifies people. But secondly, it's very hard to grab a rock while you're holding a candle, right? So there were very many conscious effort. The leader of Maidan, Bulatov, they, at the end of, so Euromaidan was a movement by those who had their own cars and were able to drive, but they would drive in these caravans with Ukrainian flags to show support for the movement, but also they became very important vehicles of security. They would, because it was becoming more and more dangerous, if it is obvious from what you're wearing that maybe you're going to Maidan or coming back from Maidan, you could be arrested on the spot. So they would drive people. They would also deliver multiple things to Maidan, including food. But at the end of December, they organized a very large caravan of cars that would go to the administration of Yanukovych. And he said the idea was to show concern, right? To show that people are not supporting what the state is doing. And the idea was very, again, it was meant to be a peaceful caravan of cars. But by the time they got there, and he said they were very close to the residence, and this was already, I believe, December 29th. So there were multiple of incidents where people were hurt and the state was ignoring social movement and all the mobilization that was trying to stop this. So he said when they got there and people started getting out of the cars, there was a feeling that it might turn violent right there. And it's a lot of people. He said that was one of the hardest things that he had to endure. And he had to endure a lot of horrible things, including torture later. It was to prevent violence, right? So he said he got on top of the car and he appealed to the people and he said, this is a peaceful movement. Please remember that today we're here only to send a message to the state. And he said there was so much tension that he experienced. He then was not sure if he could get off the car, right? Because there was constantly a lot of tension. So all these attempts to mobilize movements, and again, it's grassroots. It was not, people were not members of specific parties. They were not organized by anybody. So how do you control the anger of people watching their friends being killed and tortured? But after the state started shooting people, after the violence became so obvious, people said they understood that peaceful message will no longer be efficient, that they understood that they're dealing with completely different state and state agents than they thought they were. And that is what started changing their mind. And eventually, many people, even if they themselves did not use violence, they essentially supported violence to be used by other groups, because they believed if Maidan fails, then Ukraine is going to be authoritarian for decades to come. So therefore, violence against security forces and violent police was the only option. And here were the elderly people who were telling me the stories that they were collecting cobblestones. So it was a group of people, 75 plus, who were standing in the middle of the square collecting cobblestones in February that were to be used against live ammunition of police. It might sound naive, but it really, because of course, the live ammunition is a much more efficient weapon that the state was using, but it was the number of people. And it was their determination to stop these abuses and the regime that Ukraine was turning into. So the multiple aspects of the book was to show not only that what happened, but how people changed during the revolution, why they embraced, or in many, why they started supporting violence, why they thought it was very important to keep fighting, even when they knew that tomorrow, if they come to Maidan, they might be hurt, they might be tortured, or they might be killed. It's in understanding these complex changes that people underwent. So many of them said that they believed they were pacifists, but facing that choice, they said, if this is the only way, if fighting violent state is the only way to preserve democracy, then they had to embrace it. And yet another aspect of the book was to show how people learned about each other from each other. Many never experiences, so some people said they never heard Ukrainian folk songs. And here a lot of people from different parts of Ukraine, lots of rural areas would come, and as they were helping each other, making sandwiches, preparing food, they would, many would sing Ukrainian folk songs. And there was something that others picked up, but most importantly, they kept debating the meanings of democracy. They were debating the meanings of civic duty. And that is what I was trying to capture in the book, is the breakage with the totalitarian legacy that was left after the Soviet Union, where people distrusted not only the state, but they distrusted each other. They only trusted very close social networks to procure, for example, certain products during the Soviet Union. But here, many said that they changed because they learned to trust others who were supporting the idea of democratic Ukraine, of free Ukraine, just like themselves. And it's fighting together, and it's fighting and sacrificing their lives for the idea of democracy together that changed them as they were trying to change their country.
Thank you. This is very illuminating and insightful. It's time for us to wrap up our conversation, and I have two questions for you. So something that has been bothering the Maidaners and have not been yet answered in the scholarly discourse is why Yanukovych fled.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There are a number of other movements in the world, right, that are trying to, that are or were trying to find the state, but or state repression, change their regime, but not all are successful. Right. So why is it that in Ukraine it became successful? And of course, one of the major reasons was the sheer amount of people who participated. So if it was with several million of people, it was a significant fraction of the population, right up to 10% of the population of the country, which for revolutionary movement is substantial. And also, of course, the fact that Ukraine was democratic since 2004 and democratic values were much more spread in Ukraine. So it was understood at that time among the Maidaners that they will keep fighting, that they didn't even know what nobody knew it was going to end when it did, but the determination to keep going and this lack of fear that was overwhelmed by determination to not accept authoritarian regime. So the sheer number of people and the democratic values that spread in the country that affected political elites as well. So Ukrainians did already, they didn't have to completely change regime where you have everybody in those institutions who were with Yanukovych. Many people who worked in multiple regional governments, for example, they supported the people and they openly said that. And within for example, police, not the secret, not the special forces like Berkut, but within the police, certain elites were not in support of Yanukovych's movement, of Yanukovych's decisions, excuse me. So Yanukovych understood that if he were to stay, that it will not end the way he perhaps wanted it to end, and that is do quick repression and assert authoritarian government. And perhaps it was shock for everyone to see that Ukrainians kept going even after the sniper shootings. But that determination, the amount of people and democratic values that even existed among certain elites, therefore those forces were much stronger than even those in power. And so staying there would cause a civil conflict for a very long time that would still eventually bring Yanukovych's downfall, just with much more bloodshed. And I think that clarity forced Yanukovych to leave.
Thank you. And the last question for today would be how the events on the Maidan and the formation of the civil society that was crystallized back then help us understand the Russo-Ukrainian War and Ukraine's resistance throughout, well, the 4 years of the full-scale war, and as well as Ukrainians' involvement in the fighting Russia in Ukraine's east.
Absolutely. And that's an excellent question. And I spent quite a bit, so last chapter, the epilogue was devoted to that. So let's remember that Russia invaded Ukraine 2 days after the Maidan Revolution, right? And it was obviously not a coincidence, because democratic Ukraine meant much more likely Ukraine staying sovereign, meaning Putin had much better chances of controlling Ukraine through his puppet regime, such as Yanukovych was turning into, and was to some extent during his rule. Here, we have determination of people who are willing to die for the sake of democracy. And therefore, it's incredibly hard to control a country like that. So therefore, Putin understood that the only way to control Ukraine was through military means. But he couldn't carry out a full-scale invasion, not quite yet. In 2014, he was able to carry out annexation of Crimea, and Russian forces were fighting, and Russian security forces were fighting in eastern Ukraine alongside paramilitary groups in eastern Ukraine. But it took 8 years of systematic state propaganda in Russia to convince the Russian audience, to convince the Russian populace that it is okay to kill their neighbors. It is okay to kill their relatives. Right? Many people in Russia have relatives in Ukraine. They weren't absolutely willing to support that in 2014. But after 8 years of genocidal propaganda about Maidan, systematic falsehoods about Maidan movement, and systematic purposeful representation of Ukrainian people as inferior, as those who could not rule themselves, as some kind of country overwhelmed by ultra-right movements, etc. 8 years of this dehumanizing propaganda, that is what allowed Putin to carry out full-scale invasion in 2022.
Thank you very much. And my understanding is that you explore this last topic that you've discussed in your next book, which is actually coming our way soon as well. Well, thank you so much for this conversation today. Congratulations on your on the publication of your book on Maidan, and good luck with the next project.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Hameta.